Apart from the judicial work, what other main things filled up your days, your working days? Were you involved in the taxation at all, or?
Well, taxation caused a great deal of trouble in my time because they'd never been taxed before, directly taxed, that is. Lugard, in theory, when Nigeria was combined, the two north and southern provinces were combined in 1914. The idea was native administration was to be extended to the eastern provinces. Well, the DOs put in a rearguard action and kept it at bay until I got out. And when they could no longer say that they hadn't got enough staff to do this.
Your arrival tipped the balance.
Well, my arrival and my colleagues' arrivals tipped the balance, and they could no longer say we hadn't got enough people to do it. And they introduced it just at the time when the bottom had fallen out of the palm oil market, and this area lived by exporting palm oil, and it was going down and down and down. It was in the 29, 27, 29. And we were forced to take nominal rolls and then collect tax from these people who'd never paid tax before. Well, the people we made collect the tax were the people who we'd recognised as so-called warrant chiefs. In other words, we gave them a warrant to sit in the native court and try cases. They were sort of JPs, as it were. And these unfortunates had to collect the tax. Well, the next year, there was a rumour went round, circulated no doubt by the men, that women were going to be taxed. And all the women mobilised and rioted, and the whole thing ended up by troops shooting about 36 of them dead in a terrible commotion which attracted a great deal of colonial attention and led to Margaret Green being sent out and writing Igbo women's affairs.
Oh. Did you know Margaret Green?
Oh yes, I was district officer at Kigley, and I found her the particular village where she did her research.
She's given all her papers to the department archive.
I brought them in.
You brought them in, that's right, yes. What sort of person was she? Was she a good anthropologist?
She was a good anthropologist, and the pity of it was that when she went to Mbadja, she became hooked on language. And so she ended up working hard on the Igbo language and gave up more or less any further anthropological study.
I see.
Which was a terrible pity because she, unlike Sylvia Leith Ross, she really did produce a valuable work. The only work that I know of that's been done specifically on African women in such detail.
Yes. What was the basis of the taxation? Was it, you say it was a nominal roll, was it based on land or wealth or just a
we
head
were asked
tax?
to assess the income of the people.
Each person?
Of an average tax-paying male. Completely bogus. The great thing, you decide to do something, then you have to have documents to prove it. And all sorts of assessment reports, they were called, were produced, showing you what the earning, working out what you thought the earning of a particular village was, broken down into particular individuals and so on. And it had no real scientific validity at all. It was just a guess.
Do you think people were lenient, or in your case, it must have been very awkward to have to do this, knowing that you were pressing on people who were already suffering from a drop in their income, who'd never been taxed before, and so on?
Well, the whole thing was absolutely ridiculous. In northern Nigeria, assessment reports worked because you went to a village and you assessed it, and the village paid a sort of collective tax. And the people in the village had for years paid tax. All that Lugard's government did was to make it a bit more regular and less oppressive. But in the East, nobody had paid tax. And they were paying quite a tax if you consider how much palm oil they exported and the export duties that the government was charging on the palm oil and kernels when they left the country, which were naturally affected in the price that was paid to these people for their palm oil. But, and of course, it was not an assessment tax on a village, it was an assessment tax on adult, able-bodied males. And young men had no money at all. Old men might have a little money. The
It had to
people
be
who
paid
probably had a lot of money, certainly in the Yoruba side, were the women, because they traded in the market.
It had to be paid in cash, did it?
It was paid in cash.
Was the idea that there's, as you know, various theories as to why these colonial taxes were put on, and one theory is that it was a indirect way of forcing people into the labour market, thereby in order to pay their taxes they would have to work for you, and then you could sell them your products as well. Was there anything in that theory, or was it just that it was felt that the colonial administration was expensive and it should pay its own way?
Well, there never was any kind of pressure to get people into the labour market in Nigeria because the population was too heavy. And the eastern region were looking for jobs everywhere. And there was no problem there at all.
There were plenty of people to do the jobs.
Plenty of people to do the jobs, and unlike northern Nigeria, southern Nigeria, young men were expendable because the farming work was done by men and women, and could be done by the elderly men, and could be done throughout the year, whereas in northern Nigeria you wanted a labour force to work very fast and in quantity when the rains came. Then they were idle for the rest of the year.
So you had this unpleasant taxation job, you had your judicial work. Were there any other main parts of the day?
Prison.
Well, there were all sorts of things. You were helping the people plan and develop their country, planning roads and so on, putting up buildings and trying to suggest introduce different crops or different variations of land holding and things like that sort of thing.
And as one of part of related to your judicial work, you had some work in relation to the prisons, did you?
Well, in the station itself, somebody was in charge of the prisons. You were usually the junior ADO. Somebody was in charge of the local treasury, because there was always government money that had to be paid out, government money which had to be received. One of the things that's not mentioned in the old days of colonial administration is the cost of transport. Your loads had to be carried and on people's heads, and you needed about 20 people when you travelled, and you travelled all the time, if you had any sense, because you were moving around in your division seeing what was happening. And that was a very expensive idea. As soon as you got cars in, you needed roads, and so you had to plan roads and talk with the people where they wanted the roads to go and so on. They would say, we want a road to our town. You'd go out and show them or talk with them about a suitable route to take, avoiding streams and rivers, because they would think in terms of a road, you'd go straight there if you're walking. You'd say, no, you've got to go around here, explain why.
When you were walking, as you seem to have been a lot of the time, were you keeping these tour diaries that were kept in other official tour diaries to say where you'd been and what you'd noticed?
Well, these were things that were introduced in the very early days, before my time, and nobody ever bothered to keep them up, because you were doing far too many other things. You may have been walking. Later on, of course, you were going by car, and anyhow, in early days you went on a bicycle. Your office followed you, and you always had a vast amount of paperwork that you had to deal with as well. I had tables made in my rest houses, 6 foot square, about this size, any bigger. And my boy would put my breakfast here and I'd come and eat it. A court messenger would come in from the office and put my office files there, and I'd move from my breakfast to my office files. And then if I had a bath, they'd put my clothes on another corner of the table.
So you,
and so on.
you revolved around this
You
table.
revolve around the table like a man has his teapot.
And you had a standard table in each.
Standard sized table.
What else did you take with you on your tours?
Well, you normally took with you a camp table, camp chair, camp bed, a bath, a tin bath. You had...
Was this the famous tin bath that was also used for getting across rivers or some...
Oh, you could if you didn't want to wade or swim. You could sit in your tin bath. The bath, you see, had a wicker basket inside it, which contained your clothes, so it contained all your clothes. And you take that out and sit in it, and people would ferry it across. If the river, that would only a river that was shallow enough for people to walk and steady the bath. You wouldn't risk it in a deep river. But it was one way of crossing rivers if you didn't want to get your feet wet.
So you would process with about 10 or 15 porters?
No, 20.
20. With all this paper and a tent.
Well, in Calabar, where I used to do this, through the forests of Oban, near this Quarop Reserve, you'd be woken at daybreak, as soon as it got light, with an orange and a cup of tea or something of that sort. You would get up and walk, and after around about 9 o'clock you'd catch up with your breakfast, which had gone ahead and preceded you. While you were having your breakfast, your bed and the rest of your camp equipment went on. And when you'd finished your breakfast, you got up and continued walking. And by about 2 or so, you got to your final destination. And there was lunch waiting for you. Or if it's a longer walk, you might have a snack lunch on the way and arrive at about 4 or 5 and find a hot bath waiting for you. They'd boil the water in a couple of kerosene tins and put it into your beautiful hot bath, and there it was waiting for you.
What were you eating on these tours? I mean, did you take a lot of food with you, or did you eat whatever happened to be available in the area?
Both. You had various tin things. You had splendid outfitting firms called Colonial Outfitters. Mine was called Griffiths McAllister. And you went into this place just before you went back from your leave.
In London?
In London. And you'd say, bring me the invoice you gave me for last year. You'd go through the invoice and say, well, I don't want that, I think I'll have that. And they'd suggest things, and in about half an hour you'd have planned the amount of tinned food you'd be sent out with you for that tour for 18 months. And it had been made up into boxes of the right kind. So many boxes, 1 box of flour, 1 of tins of tinned fruit, salmon, various other tins and so on. And that would form your basic store. And then you'd live on local meat and local vegetables wherever you could get them. Yams rather than potatoes, and a thing called okra you've probably heard of. And any fruit you could get. Bananas, of course, and oranges.
What about drink? Did you take large stocks of...
Well, you could buy that locally. So you didn't bother to take those out with you, because anyhow you couldn't take enough drink for a tour, it would ruin you. Though whiskey, I may say, only cost 5 bob when I went out there first. But it went up to about 10 to 15 bob while I was out there. But whiskey was your cheapest drink.
Really?
Beer, you see, in those days had to be sent out in bottles and naturally cost a lot.
Didn't whiskey...
It was only with independence and after World War II that they started building local breweries. The Belgians got onto it first, and they supplied us during the war with beer from the Belgian Congo. And we found this extremely gave us a great deal of headaches and so on, and we protested about this, and then they went into it and said, oh, they were sorry. They supplied us with the wrong quality of beer. This was the kind they supplied their local natives.
That's nice. When you were travelling through all these villages, were you struck by The beauty, I mean, I've never been in that part of the world. Was it very beautiful as you toured through the landscape? Or?
Well, not in my part. Nigeria varies. Where you've got mountains and things like that, it can be beautiful, but where you've got tropical rainforest, you don't see anything.
And this was tropical rainforest?
And this was tropical rainforest, or in the most of the surrounding country, secondary forest growth. So that you'd have vegetation about the height of this room or so. And then as soon as it gets to this height or a little lower, men would go in underneath with cutlasses and slash it down and burn it and then farm it.
Yes, so it was a slash and burn.
Slash and burn, but rotation.
Yes. On a 7-year rotation? Or?
Very depending on the soil and depending on the density of population. So for every 4th year in most places that I knew of, where it was dense, and then it would go up higher. There's an optimum period in each case, and they've worked it out over centuries. Don't go away with the idea that they're simple, brainless agriculturalists. They know their system, and all you've got to do is to help them improve it by suggesting things that they now can afford to buy, like fertilizers.
Yes, well, I found that in the Himalayas too. They know it much better than we could ever.
They know it very much better, and it differs in each area.
It's very
and the experts who come out and advise these modern independent governments don't know a damn thing locally, because they never go out of their headquarter stations or their agricultural headquarter stations.
Yes, I've seen that. And they were cultivating with hoes, were they, or on the hoe?
Hoes, and you get to do 2 varieties of hoes. In the savannah country, they use long-handled hoes and get the leverage there. In the forest country, it's eastern Nigeria anyway. It's soft soil, sandy, and they use short-handled hoes.
And was the work mainly done by women, or?
It varies. The Yoruba men, Hausa, northern Nigeria mainly men, eastern Nigeria men and women. The men cut, slash and burn. The combined family raise the yam hills. The men plant yams, the women plant cover crops on this area. The men train the yam vines, the women weed, and then the men dig up the yams, the women plant additional crops, and the men store their yams, and the women store their crops, and each own their own particular crops.
Did you see any of their, the other side of their life, their ritual and religious activities at all?
You could if you wanted to. I attended various funerals and so on. I found something rather difficult at times, and they were killing animals alive and so on. But you could if you wanted to, and in my day they were only too pleased for you to turn up and see some of their masquerades.
They wore fantastic masks.
Oh yes, it was as far as West African sculpture is concerned, of course eastern Nigeria is a key place.
Yes. So, Gwelym, to continue, I asked you whether you'd seen rituals and religious performances, and you mentioned that you'd seen some masks. When did you first become interested in art, West African art?
Well, I became interested in African art when I was still at Oxford, when modern art had just hit the place, and Michael Sadler was doing the same sort of thing there, and Roger Fry in Cambridge, and African art came in with this, and with people like Modigliani and so on. And I became interested in it then, and when I went out to Nigeria, I started trying to collect it and trying to record it, because when I was there, it was on the way out. Masquerades cost a lot of money to maintain and provide, and Christianity was taking on, and with Christianity education. The Igbos were very keen on the latter and could only get it through the former. And the Christians were saying that mosques were idols and should be destroyed. Fundamentally, I think what it amounted to was that there was only a limited amount of money going around, and that should be spent, they thought, on education, on catechists and village schools, rather than on wasteful things like masquerades. But anyhow, masquerades were unpopular and gradually fading. And I found when I was out there that the people who were still trying to provide these mosques were only too pleased to get some official white support for them, and were ready to welcome me there and allow me to take photographs as I wished. Then the only problem was that I couldn't take the right kind of photographs, because photography in Nigeria, as done by anthropologists in the good old days, consists of sending the negatives home to be developed. By the time they got home by steamer and through Fort Sticks on carriers, they were pretty grainy by the time they'd been developed. And I found that it was necessary to take your film out of its case, airtight case, load it into the camera, shoot it, and then develop it that evening before it became grainy. The only difficulty about the development was that the temperature was so hot. The water was usually about 70 or so, and with films in those days, this melted the gelatin on the film, so you had to harden them first. However, it was quite easy to pick up the technique, and I soon mastered it, and so that was the way I operated. I took photographs of masquerades, wherever I could get them, and then developed them the same evening. No difficulty about a dark room, because I had a Helson torch, and I merely put a yellow filter over the glass front, and it was dark enough in the back of my rest house to develop anything.
What camera did you use at that time?
Well, I tried one of these Rolleiflexes and stuck to it in the end. I also tried a Leica, but it was much more complicated developing 35mm film. And anyhow, usually you didn't want as much as 35 exposures in a single day. It was a rather waste of the film. So I stuck to a Rolleiflex which had 12 exposures on the film.
You had to do it in the same day? You couldn't keep the film in the camera over 2 days? Or?
No, I took it out of the camera immediately, put it back in its case and shoved the lid on it. And before it could get grainy, hardened it and developed it the same evening. And that's why my negatives now that I've unearthed are still as good as they were in those days.
How many photographs did you take? Have you any idea?
I don't know how many I did, but I got a few, well, I should think well over 500 or so, which I now am building up as a collection for this Cambridge Museum.
Yes, and you published some of them then?
Oh, a lot of them I published with various articles.
Yes, and in a book?
And I wrote a book eventually.
Yes.
But nobody was particularly interested in publishing the kind of book I wanted to publish. In those days, the only book tolerated by publishers was a coffee table idea which covered the whole of West Africa and showed one mosque from Dogon and one mosque from Gabon, one from Nigeria and so on. What I felt, as Haddon did, that the only suitable way of publishing things is to get a whole lot of mosques from a single area together so that you can get some idea of the collective value of it.
Did you photograph other things apart from the sort of inanimate?
I photographed the odd film of people farming and working and so on, but they weren't quite so interesting and I didn't take quite so many of them. And I was also operating on a obsolete form of physical anthropology called biometrics, in which you measured people's heads. And I took a lot of photographs of prisoners' heads, and I measured a lot of heads as well. And I now find that this form is completely out of date because it's been, nobody believes that you get anywhere with it.
this was later you took these photographs after you'd done some training in anthropology, presumably, not at the beginning when you first went out.
Well, I took the photographs when I first went out, but I didn't. In my first tour, I took practically nothing. In my second tour, I took a few, but it was not until my third tour that I was in an area where there were a lot of masks, and I decided I'd have to do something about it.
So you made a visual record with a camera. Did you also collect? You mentioned collecting.
Oh, I collected masks, and most of the ones that I collected originally are now in the Pitt Rivers Museum, Oxford, because I gave it to them when I came on leave in 1937. In those days you could bring an awful lot of loads back with you because you travelled by boat, and the Colonial Office paid for your transport of loads out and back. And I arrived, I remember one time at Plymouth and unloaded and got onto the train. I think it was 15 cases or more of skulls.
Skulls?
I described them as anthropological specimens, and the customs didn't bother to look at them. But these skulls went with me up to London and eventually up to Oxford to the Department of Anatomy there.
Well, this was part of the physical anthropology.
This was part of my physical anthropology. I also at the same time had a whole lot of masks which went to the Pitt Rivers Museum.
Whose skulls were these?
These were skulls that I'd collected in the bush. In this particular division, Orlu, where I was posted, native doctors attributed a great deal of ill health to the persecution of discontented ghosts. You buried your Auntie Aggie and you hadn't buried her properly, and she was disappointed with you, and she was making you ill to make you realise that you should treat her better. Well, if you didn't want to treat her better, or if you couldn't afford it, the remedy was to dig up her remains, particularly the skull, which was the important part, and throw it away in that little bit of the forest that was still existing and was sacred to the tutelary village deity. And these bad bushes, as they call them, were a repository of masses of skulls. And I asked their owners if they had any objection to my removing these skulls to a safer place, and they said no, not at all. So I collected a complete, I think it was about just under 100 of them, and eventually took them home with me when I went on leave and pawned them off in the anatomy department in Oxford. They remained there until Dudley Buxton, who was the chief protagonist of this biometrical method, died, and they abolished his post. And the new professor, Legros Clark, was only interested in the central nervous system of monkeys, and he threw the whole lot out. They're now in South Kensington, I believe, but I've never checked.
What did the people think you were going to do with these skulls? And did they ask what their destiny
well, they thought that all Europeans were mad anyway.
Yes.
And they thought I was sane in other respects, anyhow respects as far as they were concerned. I treated them reasonably well and so on, and they thought that they might as well humour me, and anyhow, I might want them for medicinal purposes. People wanted all sorts of odd things for turning into medicines.
So they thought you might grind them up and
They provided I didn't use them against them, and I can be sure that I wouldn't. They didn't mind my taking them. And anyhow, I was a district officer, and so they didn't want to be objectionable.
Yes.
But they made no objection. They couldn't care less as far as I could make out. Yes, I went on collecting masks, but the Nigerians produced an antiquities ordinance which defined masks as antiquities, and you couldn't export them. And K.C. Murray, who was the head of the antiquities department, knew exactly what I'd collected because I'd collected them with him. And he took them off me when I left the country, and most of them are now in the Nigerian Museum. He let me bring a few home, and I've got them still with me here. And I'll probably leave them to the museum. I haven't decided what to do with them yet.
Have you got some with you in the house?
Well, I've got some in the house,
What-
this sort of thing.
They would wear that. How would they wear that over their face?
Well,
Looks
they'd
a bit
wear
small.
this over their face. They'd be dressed in a costume which completely hid their form and disguised them. In some areas, they let the hands and the feet be exposed. In others, they covered them up with cloth.
They were always carved out of wood, were they, like that, or? were they
Mostly, sometimes they made them out of composite material, leather and wood and clay and things like that. But it was mainly wood, and they were extremely efficient wood carvers, of course.
And they had ritual significance. Did
Well, it depended. Your masquerade was usually performed by young men, and in most areas they were members, particular grade, shall we say, in so-called secret societies.
being secret, they didn't mind you getting hold of
Well, the
these masks?
secret was laid in the masks, but and women were not supposed to see them. But things were getting very lax when I was there, and in any case, they had already got around to selling these masks and trading them, and the secrecy really lay in the character of the actor who was inside the costume and the mask when he was performing.
So there was no worry about you having them and displaying them in British museums,
There was no worry about that at all, no.
that they'd be seen by European women.
No, women were entitled to see the masks usually when they were on the actors' heads and so on when they were performing, but they were only able to see them as characters. They weren't supposed to see them loose.
What interested you about? I mean, you mentioned that the sort of modern art movement, Modigliani and various Henry Moore and others at that time, they were beginning to get interested in primitive art. But what interested you? Did you feel aesthetically attracted to these?
Well, it's difficult to say. There are fashions that hit universities, and most people are sufficiently, what shall I say, imitative to fall in for the fashion. I liked African art, and I found it appealed increasingly to me. When I was at school, I fell for the Victorian type of art. Things like Hylas and the water nymphs and other proud acquisitions of, say, the Liverpool Public Art Gallery, which have now come back into favour, I believe.
Yes. So you thought that that's a beautiful object, and I would like to.
I thought it was a beautiful object, and I thought I'd like to possess it, and I also felt that I wanted to record the way it was used.
You had the feeling that it was all disappearing very fast,
And it was disappearing very fast because they were throwing them away. And most of the villages you might see a mask in a house, and they'd say, "Oh, this isn't from an old play which we no longer use."
Did you collect anything else apart from masks and skulls?
Yes, I collected various anthropological objects. When I was in the Agoja province, I collected stone celts, which were referred to as there as elsewhere as thunderstones. They were supposed to be thunderbolts.
Yes. There are huge collections of those in the pit rivers from all
Well-
over the world. What was the purpose of collecting those?
Well, for classifying them, they felt that you could tell the difference between them, and they were the only relics left behind by earlier civilizations or cultures.
I see, so sort of
And their distribution in eastern Nigeria was interesting. You only got them on the forest margin, and I got a tremendous lot in one particular area which must have been heavily populated once. I saw one on a shrine for the sky, spirit of the thunder and the sky. And I said, "You get many of these about?" And they said, "Oh yes, we find them in our farming." And I said, "Well, I'll give you threepence for each one you bring me. Well, I thought that was a expensive enough bribe to bring any that were around, but I had to reduce it to a penny because they brought me so many. And I took them all back, and they're now somewhere in the Pitt Rivers Museum. But when I moved to an adjacent area, the people and I couldn't see a single one.
You were obviously by this time beginning to get interested in anthropology. Had you? What sort of first attracted you to that discipline?
Well, I never heard about anthropology until I went on to the Colonial Services course that had just begun to operate at Oxford. And I was hooked on anthropology by R.R. Marriott. He was a brilliant lecturer at the time and stimulated my interest in it. And afterwards I decided I'd go back to Oxford and take a course in anthropology. The Colonial Office and the Nigerian government encouraged its people to take various courses, either in law or anthropology or similar ancillary subjects. And I hoped it might also help to extend my leave, which it did on the second but not the first occasion. So I took a course I think I gained a certificate in anthropology from Oxford.
What year was that?
That was probably in the year 27, 8 and 29, 30, I think.
So you went twice?
I went twice, or 21, 30, 33 or something like that. Can't remember exactly, but it was about that time.
So you'd been in Africa for about 5 years?
I'd been in Africa for I went back on my first leave and took the beginning of the course and applied for extension of leave and was refused. And then on my next leave, I went back again. And the leaves occurred every sort of 2 years. Sort of thing.
Who were the people teaching that course in Oxford at that time?
Oh, well, Oxford anthropology was extremely amusing. Looking back on it, it was like all Gaul divided into 3 parts. And the reason for that was that the 3 people who taught it, or at least 2 of them, couldn't stand each other and were not prepared to communicate practically. You had Marriott, who wrote books on Mana and animism, who taught the social side.
He was the rector of...
He was a classicist like Fraser, and anthropology was his hobby, and he taught it in his spare time, so to speak. Then there was Balfour, who was the curator of the Pitt Rivers Museum. He had a private income of his own, that's why he could afford to be so. And Marriott and Balfour avoided each other. And the third member of the trio was Professor Thompson, who was professor of anatomy in the anatomy school, and he taught physical anthropology. And there was an unfortunate dog's body, Tom Penniman, who eventually replaced Balfour as curator of the Pitt Rivers Museum. But in my day, he was supporting himself by the few supervisions he could give in anthropology and supervising for each of these 3 parts. Then you had an exam which covered the 3.
What were these particular people like? What was Balfour like as a person and lecturer?
Well, Balfour, if you were interested in material culture and objects, without reference very much to the social side that they might be associated with, he was very good. But he was mainly of the classificatory kind, and very much a Pitt Rivers man.
Yeah.
Marriott, on the other hand, was purely religion and nothing else. London, of course, was even more amusing at the time because they had the same exam for 2 different schools of anthropology. London School of Economics taught one sort with Malinowski and Seligman and Firth and so on. And University College taught about diffusionism and so on. And they set the same exam, but their pupils had to answer the right questions.
So Balfour was a nice man, as far as I can gather from the...
Well, Balfour was quite a nice man. I didn't see very much of him because they never had you round, they merely lectured to you, and that's all you saw of them. Penniman was the one I associated with.
But
I used to go down with him and dig for mammoth bones and so on in Welsh caves.
He always looked rather a glum character in his photographs. Was he glum in life, or...?
Well, he wasn't, no, he was quite cheerful in life. When he wasn't in the Pitt Rivers, he went down to a farm in the Gower Peninsula and spent his holidays there. But he was always a loner.
And Marrett, you said, was a brilliant lecturer.
Marrett was a brilliant lecturer, but the trouble with Marrett was in later years he became completely senile. I went to a most embarrassing anthropological meeting there where he introduced the lecturer and went on talking for 3/4 of the time allocated for the lecture. And we had to be out of the lecture theatre by a certain time. This had been told to the lecturer in advance, and he rather brilliantly cut his lecture down to 1/4 of an hour.
Who was the person who you mentioned lectured, and he'd given the same lectures for many years, and the only person in the audience was his wife, who used to sit in the front row?
Oh, I don't know that. I don't remember that one. That's not one of my stories.
Oh, it's a very nice story. And he would used to say, he'd given this lecture so often and seen his wife knitting in the front row. She used to come to all his lectures because no one else used to come and sit there knitting. So he would sort of turn and say, "And now, my dear Helen or Anne or whoever it was, we can see." And she would nod her head and go on knitting. But this isn't one of your stories.
No, that's not one of my stories.
So, at that time, what did you specialise in anthropology, or was it just a general certificate course?
Well, on the certificate course I got through on the strength of a report. I'd written a reorganisation report on a tribe in one of my divisions. That was this thing that carried the day because I committed all sorts of crimes in the physical anthropology. I classified a Japanese skull, I remember, as an African one. Did various other terrible errors of that sort.
Yeah.
There was a bit of archaeology in it as well. And I have the distinction, or I had, I don't know who you've got now in the department, but I had the distinction of being the only social anthropologist who knew what the archaeologists were talking about. Because I alone had been taught a little bit of archaeology.
Yes. Were there any other anthropologists or people who went on to do anthropology in the course with you at that time, or was it a very small course?
It was a very small course, and most of the people on it were colonial people like myself. Some people, for instance, called Culwick,
Oh, yes.
a man who wrote a book on East Africa, and then retired to Southern Rhodesia, as it then was, and wrote a book saying Britannia weighs the rules.
So yes, I've seen a copy of that book.
But he and his wife were there.
Yes.
And Rupert East, who wrote a book on the Tiv in eastern Nigeria, he took the course at the same time as I did.
Yes. So this course didn't disenchant you with anthropology, you were still interested?
I was still interested, and I also at the same time, on the second occasion when I was on this course, the second part, I used to drive Marjorie Perham, of all people, up to seminars at Malinowski's course at the LSE.
Oh, well, you mentioned there are two very famous names. When we start with Marjorie Perham, and she's obviously a terribly distinguished lady whose books are in much demand even nowadays. What sort of person, apart from a driver, what sort of person was she?
Well, she was a brilliant young woman and extremely handsome. And she graduated in history at Oxford during the war. And then she was sent for a couple of years to lecture to the troops before demobilisation. And then she became a lecturer at Sheffield University, where she lectured to one of my Nigerian colleagues, Culwick. And then she became a fellow at St Hugh's. and she put colonial history on the map. And the Calwicks introduced me to her, and I saw her when she came out to Nigeria to write a book on Nigeria. But in order to get this grant to go to Nigeria, it was, I think, Wenegren or one of these American foundations. Malinowski had persuaded them to subsidize research in the field for anthropology, and he had a very brilliant group of people attending this seminar at the LSE. All the ones who became professors later on, Nardell, Fortes, the two Wilsons, Oberg, who faded out, and later on Lucy Mayer, what's his name?
Raymond Firth, Audrey Richards.
No, not Firth. Firth was a lecturer already there. But Audrey Richards is the one I was trying to think of. But all those people were there. And Marjorie Penham was forced much to her fury because she felt she was a historian and not an anthropologist. But in order to receive the grant, part of the conditions were they should receive instruction from Malinowski before they went into the field, which was a useful way of bringing money into the LSE.
I see. So
And she had to attend these seminars, and I drove her up and attended two.
What were the seminars like? They were legendary.
Well, the only one I can remember, they were dismal, very dismal affairs, because Malinowski knew nothing about Africa and didn't know what sort of questions to raise afterwards. And he'd let the person who was reading the paper go on, and the people in the audience asking any questions they could think of. And if the man reading the paper, usually the ones I saw were pretty dull, there was very little you could talk about at all.
So instead of this scintillating, sparkling occasion which the myths tell us about, the great Malinowski seminar, it was rather a drab affair.
Well, I feel that if they'd had a seminar on Melanesian things, he'd have come out in a big way. But as you've read in his book on culture, or whatever it is, where he refers to Africa, he knew nothing about it. And the place, and had no intention of reading up about it either.
Did you get any impression of him as a person? He's supposed
No,
to be...
he didn't inspire me at all. I knew that he'd written brilliant books, but I judged him from his appearance at the seminars, and I was rather disappointed.
Was there anyone else who you were impressed with or formed any friendship with at that time?
Well, I liked very much the Wilsons and Nardell. I saw a good deal of Nardell. I didn't see much of Fortes. He wasn't around much, but he was there. And Firth, of course, was already a lecturer on the staff.
Yes. Nardell, what nationality was Nardell? Was he?
Central European, Austrian, I think.
He had some connection with Australia, didn't he? Or was it he went to Australia?
I think he went to Australia afterwards. He went to Australia afterwards and wrote a book when he got there.
Yes.
But he wrote a brilliant book on Bida.
Yes.
Which is one of the many Nigerian classics.
Yes. So, having driven up and down the A40 or whatever it was from Oxford, you then went back to, you were just on leave, you went back to West Africa. This must have been now taking you into the early 30s.
Yes.
Was there a feeling in West Africa that things were changing and that perhaps, it was well before the winds of change and so on, but that perhaps the British Empire was not destined to last forever?
Well, I can only speak of what I encountered in the eastern Nigeria rather than anywhere else. But certainly at that time it was a reaction from the shock of these women's riots that had happened in 27, 28. And the feeling that we must pacify the women at all costs and we must consider them. Then later, from about 37, 39 onwards, you got a feeling towards change and independence, and a lot of people came round, including Zik. Zik was beginning to build up.
What was Zik? He was a person.
Zikiwe
Hmm.
was his name. He was an Igbo politician who was a brilliant newspaper editor, and he was able to use the newspaper for the first time in Nigeria to mobilize the English reading intellectuals behind him.
You mentioned the women's riots and protests. Did the British take any notice in relation to taxation? Did they stop the offensive taxes?
No, because the women rioted to say that women should not pay tax.
Yes.
Well, they did pay tax on the western side because they were extremely wealthy, the Yoruba market women.
Yes.
But women in the eastern region never paid tax. We had to go around preaching this at all costs. They must never pay tax. They won their case completely in that respect. And of course, it was a period in England when the British people were shocked by these riots. First of all, Amritsar. Amritsar hit them badly as far as India was concerned. And then in Nigeria, you suddenly had women being shot by troops. 36 of them.
Yes, terrible.
More or less in cold blood. When they were unarmed. They were said to be attacking the treasury with sticks, but they were really demonstrating, and you don't shoot up demos. But in the good old days, the rules of dispersing riots was you've got somebody to come out and read the Riot Act, which nobody could understand,
and
then order the crowd to disperse. And then if the crowd didn't disperse, you ordered the troops to fire, and the troops were told not to fire above their heads because that would merely encourage them to come on, but to fire to kill. And they did.
No one was.
After that, of course, things changed, and police riot drill was very well developed in Nigeria, and when I was involved in a women's riot later on, we had no trouble at all. We danced with them until they got tired of dancing, and then arrested a few of them as they were going home.
What date was that you were dancing with the women in a riot?
Oh, this was concerning a forest reserve in Bendi. And the local people had got the wrong idea into their heads, and we couldn't get it out of them, that we were trying to take their land. What we were trying to do was to free the land from the forest reserve so they could use it. However, they told a large number of women who bought clay for their pots from this particular area that they must come and demonstrate, i.e. riot, against it. And they laid on a riot for us. And it was a very pleasant occasion in which the policemen and everybody else danced with the women as they sang and gradually edged them out of the market and so on. Had been rather awkward to begin with because the women were between the police and their rifles, which had been piled into the market. But anyhow, we gradually sorted that out. And because we were perfectly friendly and so on, nothing happened. We let them work it out as you can in a demo. It wasn't such a big riot, of course, as these, the Abar riots, so-called.
Yes.
And then when they were arrested, we found that they were not the people who were concerned in this forest reserve at all. There were many people who came from somewhere else.
All this talk of women and rioting and so on, you are now taking the mid-30s towards the late 30s. You are now aged about 32, 33, and you are still unmarried. I presume that it was the case there as elsewhere in the empire that you were discouraged from getting married too early because you wouldn't have enough income to support a wife. Was that the case in the colonial service or not?
In theory, I don't know how much in fact, but while you were a cadet, that is for the first 3 years of your service, you were not supposed to have your wife out. In fact, you're not supposed to be married. But I know quite a number of cadets who were married and who had their wives out.
Yes.
But it was not supposed to be accepted. And you were discouraged from having any children out there, of course.
Yes.
Whatever your age.
Whether you were married or not.
Or whether you were married or not.
I think at this point we ought to bring in the other important person in your life, Ursula. So we got to the point where I was pointing out that it was very difficult to get married early on. But how did, well, let's turn to Ursula Jones. Ursula, how did you meet this eligible bachelor from West Africa? Were you in West Africa yourself?
No, I'd never been there. It was considered a black Calcutta by my family because a relative long before died of yellow fever, so they would never have thought of me going there. It was my cousin, who was a junior officer to Gwilym for a whole tour or more in a fairly lonely station, and they must have got to know each other pretty well. He was also a bachelor. And he did a bit of matchmaking when he came home on leave. He'd mentioned this G.I.Jones he'd like me to meet. He didn't explain why. And tried to arrange it, but that failed. And then finally he was posted to Mauritius. I was sorry because I'd always been rather fond of him, but he'd ignored me. And many years had passed in between that. I was then 25, and I'd really first known him and liked him when I was about 18. So he arranged for us to meet the day before he went to Mauritius in London. Gwilym was, you were invigilating some kind of...
Oh, I had an exhibition on at the Colonial Office of Nigerians' masks.
Mm.
And I was working in...
Photographs of them.
I was working in Australia House and only had an hour off for lunch. And in the air liaison office it was just about to, blow up because this was August, perhaps July,
39.
August 39.
I see.
You had a job at the Air Ministry.
Yes, and...
the Australian Air Ministry.
I was told to look out for him by my cousin who was driving up from Sussex. And I was a bit intrigued, although I wanted to see the cousin, really. But I was a bit intrigued because this man was described as a rugger player with sensitive features. So, eventually we had lunch at the Strand Palace Hotel as being the nearest place we could eat to my office. And it was very noisy, and I really didn't notice Gwilym at all because I was interested in the fact that the cousin was off next day. And I think you did get my phone number.
You gave me your phone
Oh,
number.
I gave you my phone number. I think you asked for it.
No, I think you wanted another meal.
Anyway, subsequently, you asked me to the ballet. And I was really going to spend the weekend with my aged parents in Sussex. But I was sufficiently interested to ring up as daughters do and say, shan't be coming this weekend. And so from then we really had very little time to decide because you were standing by as soon as war was declared to go back. And I didn't think it didn't take us more than a few weeks to decide, did it?
No.
Just decided to get married?
Yes.
In a few weeks?
And we sent a telegram to this chap who'd been so clever, to whom I had previously, and still was, very devoted, saying something like, what was it we said? Marrying precipitously, I think we said. Very successful, marrying precipitously. And what was nice, he subsequently married a delightful French Mauritian girl about 2 years later. So everybody was happy, and we used to meet on leave afterwards.
So was it a sensitive rugger player that you met? Or?
Well, I was swept off all right. I always wanted to travel. I never wanted to stay in England and cook. I'd already had some travelling. I'd been, as it were, around the world once, but I looked forward to going to West Africa. I didn't have any doubts, but my family were pretty horrified. I'm in the white man's grave again. But obviously one doesn't consult one's parents. And the war was very decisive. We were together in the flat that I was sharing with a relative, another young cousin, on the day war was declared, remember?
Yes. And
he'd been staying there for a week or a few days, and I think we really got to know each other when he suddenly developed an attack, you know how they fall upon you immediately, of malaria, about which I knew nothing. And he sort of said, it wasn't my bed, it was a sort of put you up couch or something in the room that my cousin and I shared, this female cousin. And he said, you better put a raincoat on Macintosh between me and the mattress because I'm going to sweat right through. I'm going to have a terrible sweating. And so we, really got to know each other pretty well then. And arranged to get married as quickly as possible, but unfortunately your father died, which made it very sad.
Quickly as possible because I was due to return to Nigeria.
He was standing by to return.
The idea was that you'd get back before
Exactly. If I hadn't married him, I wouldn't have known to go with him.
Well, my leave had expired. That was the main reason. And then, instead of going back in time, I developed appendicitis and had to have my appendix out and had to spend another month. And I had to go to the doctor and say, for God's sake, pass me as fit, because if I stay any longer in the UK, I'll have to pay UK income tax.
So you hurried
Sad
off.
thing was he'd spent all his money on leave, as they did in those days. You lived on tick, really.
Mm.
You could explain that. You bought all the things you'd need in advance.
I was
on
wondering
tick.
about that, all those tins of Oxford marmalade.
So
you
I
were
met
saying
him. He had this extraordinary Ford pickup van which rattled about London with a great
I'd driven home across the desert in it.
Which desert?
Sahara.
for the third time.
I see.
Not the third
Oh, I
time,
see
eh?
the car across. I thought you meant Ursula. I was
No, no.
Yeah.
trying to see.
I never got on that drive. I was promised it. I never got it.
So you were rattling around London in this
Yeah,
large car.
being stopped at the parks because it looked like a commercial vehicle. It was a very extraordinary looking thing to be driving in London, wasn't it?
Well, it had, in those days, you could fit any size tires because of the mud guards being high above the wheels.
Mm.
So to cross through sand, you fitted balloon tires. So they're enormous balloon-like things.
You must have looked very odd in
Looked very odd.
London.
But you could put rings around taxi drivers because they only had very low-geared vehicles in those days.
Hmm. So your parents didn't actively oppose it, they just were unhappy at the thought of you going to an early
I
grave.
think they thought it was better than the other possible son-in-law I had in mind, which they were horrified at the thought of because he didn't even have a British nationality. That was dreadful. Then we discovered that Gwilym and I each had very respectable elderly uncles. One was an admiral and one was a retired colonel, and they knew each other in Buckinghamshire or somewhere.
They were in Wokingham, and the Admiral was Lord Mayor of Wokingham, and he was another member of the town council.
This was all right, you see,
Ah.
because my uncle passed this as a relative of his would be all right. So, well, we didn't really ask them, did we? We
Announced.
had to get married quickly because I wouldn't have been able to follow him, and I really would have been stuck, as it turned out, for 5 years.
Hmm.
And
Did you have, I mean, there must have been much pacing up and down, having to take a decision on so little information.
Not
or-
really, no.
or you an
I think I
impetuous
decided very quickly. I went to North Wales for the first time to meet his mother, a poor woman. She'd just been widowed from a long and happy marriage. And I think she was very shattered because I think she thought she had her only child, although in West Africa, to look after her. And he'd never been, well, he'd taken lots of girls home, but never really appeared to be too interested in any of them. Nothing had come of it. So when we told a poor woman with very little preliminaries that we were going to get married quite quickly, she dropped a plate. I don't think she ever quite forgave me for snatching him at that point.
Had Gwilym explained to you the sort of conditions you'd be going to, for
Yes,
instance?
yes. Well, I asked a lot of questions.
Like, that he mentioned that you weren't allowed to have children in West Africa, so...
With war having just been declared, and the only war I could remember, things seemed so bizarre anyway that didn't appear to be relevant at the time.
But how were we at that time supposed not to? There was some
Oh
contraception.
yes, contraception was not exactly straightforward. Indeed
No.
not.
But
No,
Maurice Stopes was known by all educated people.
Did the colonial service provide
absolutely
contraception?
no money for any kind of consultation either.
Hmm.
Actually, I think we succeeded rather well because when, after 2 years, I became, needed leave because 18 months, he said previously 2 years, but it was 18 months who needed leave.
Hmm.
And I really got rather anemic or run down and needed to go down to wanted to come back to Britain, but had to go to the Cape, there being no transport to Britain. I was then just rather neatly pregnant, although I didn't know it.
Hmm.
So I think we managed rather successfully.
That
but
was
it
against
difficult.
the rules. You shouldn't have become pregnant, presumably.
Well,
No,
she shouldn't have
shouldn't
had
have
the
done
child.
really,
We
yeah.
shouldn't have had
Shouldn't
the
have.
child in Nigeria.
Hmm.
You often became pregnant.
Oh, I see. Oh, you could go
In
and...
fact, there was
Tell
a
the story.
lovely story about the governor, Sir Hugh Clifford, entertaining in Government House a number of young wives who were on the boat to go home, and the boat called at Lagos and they were invited to dine at Government House. And he was married to Mrs. de Lapiture, he said to them, ladies, you've only just come out of the country. Why are you leaving your husband so soon and going home? Nobody knew what the hell to say because you didn't talk about these things in those days. And Mrs. de Lapeter, or at least Lady Clifford as she then was said to remark, a pregnant silence.
I think the government were very unreasonable. But I
What
suppose they felt they didn't have the right medical services, and certainly some of the doctors were like ship's doctors, pretty
So
unpredictable.
it was the health aspect that they were worried
Yes, it was, I imagine, entirely.
about.
And I suppose it would have cluttered things up. Administrative officers wouldn't have been so keen to travel, trekking around with children. But subsequently we were allowed to bring this child born in Cape Town back for
Because
a
of
brief
the
time.
war.
Because of the war, only because of the war.
But people afterwards had their children out there.
Then later, about 2.5 years later, when I was pregnant again in England, we got special permission for me to return with him pregnant, and they posted him to some outlandish division in the Cameroons, northern Cameroons, Mamfe, which he would love to have served in, because he'd never had a chance to go up there. But of course, when we arrived and found this posting, it was quite impossible. I was already, whatever it was, 6 months pregnant, and it would have been, there wasn't even a doctor. There might have been an African doctor, but there was no hospital. So he was stuck back in Airbar, which was not so interesting for him.